really kind of does something. So I hope to somehow enjoy it, apart from learning. And I think a good place to start, maybe before we start, do you need to watch what time now? So we really have to start. Let's go around quickly, and I have to say you're getting better at it. Each week we are doing that. Just say in one sentence, short sentence, what are you working on, and your name.
Hi, I'm Dean. I'm working on the relationship between painting and photography.
Hi, my name is Matilde, and I'm working on concept of sense of loss.
Excellent.
My name is Diana, and I am working in direction, and I am doing
My name is Mary, and I'm working on structure.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm Ben, and I'm working on materials and connection with the earth.
With Earth.
I'm Julia, and I'm working on a concept for a podcast.
For a body? Cast.
I'm Alex, I'll be looking for guerrilla gardening within my work.
Everyone here knows what is guerrilla gardening?
No.
Do you want to tell us what guerrilla gardening is?
Basically, you go out and you plant stuff in areas that you're not allowed to. It's a bit like doing graffiti, but
It's like graffiti, but with flowers.
yeah.
You plant flowers. Oh, excellent.
My name is Ben. I'm working with how we deal with images in 2015.
So you have to hurry up, no?
2016.
My name is Simona, and I'm working on taming my superego through my work.
Can you repeat that?
Taming my superego through my work.
Okay. 1 second. This is what we have today. So we need to make more room around the table, if possible. If not, we'll just start to sit in a second. As long as it's possible, would it be better if we spread the tables around and then we have surfaces on each table?
But I think
You think it's okay? It's nicer? Yeah. Okay.
I'm Rebecca, and I'm working on video sculptures and drawings.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'm working on ambiguity in perception.
Hello, I'm Max. I'm working on the green and the JPEG.
Hi, I'm Michelle. Same time as ambiguity.
I'm Vinicius. I'm working on the hidden image behind the digital photography.
I'm Timo, and I'm trying to apply the principle of image taking to present the image with light.
I'm Rupert, and I'm trying to align theory with practice.
I'm Valentina, and I'm working in
I'm Dario, and I'm working on sensuality of 3D print and tactile sense as visual.
We will,
I'm Alessandro. I'm working on feelings that we cannot tell.
Just to go back to Rupert, what you said about aligning theory and practice, we will have more to say about it, because I think it's interesting, you threw in an interesting challenge. Something of that I hope we will touch upon today. Okay, let's try to start. Now, if you remember last week, we read Michel Foucault's introduction to Anti-Oedipus. That I mean, So there is a Natalia, there is a chair here.
I have one here, comment. Thank you.
Again, apologies for the discomfort. Yes. Well, it's actually not. Anyway, don't forget to get into that. Definitely not the camera. But it's not their fault, you know. Some things happen without them being the fault of anyone, and they can still be annoying. Maybe particularly annoying because there is no one to blame. At the same time, I have to say that it was also not our mistake. We had a booking. It was there for everyone to see. But you know, there is a problem with systems. Systems can be incredibly reassuring, but they're just systems. They also can cause problems. Partly that's what we are talking about today. So it's always interesting how what you read often immediately and sometimes deeply provocatively connects with what is happening in our own everyday, not only inside the CSM, but also in the United Kingdom and globally and politically. These connections, every time you read a text of that kind, even if you read it in a diagram, it just connects directly to your own experiences. And if it doesn't, maybe you're not reading the right text. But with this, I think you will see that the connections are sometimes almost too strong to bear. So last week, we read Foucault's introduction to Anti-Oedipus. And we're going to spend this session looking at this book. I want to give you a little bit of background to Anti-Oedipus. So this is a book that Deleuze and Felix Guattari wrote together in the early 70s, 1971, 1972. So this book belongs to the decade after the revolutions of 1968, which we briefly mentioned last time. We're going to talk about it a little bit more today, just to give some background. If you remember, Foucault was saying in his preface that for 20 years after the end of the Second World War, you could tell a European intellectual by three main qualities. Yeah? So if you could identify them by three main characteristics. What are they? Do you remember?
I don't remember if there was.
What do you think what sort of thing it is? Anyone can help? Marx, Freud, and
science systems.
And science systems, semiotics or signifiers. Very good. Science systems. Marx, Freud, science. Yeah, the three signs by which to tell a European intellectual believes in class struggle, believes in the Oedipal complex, believes or interprets the world through systems of science. So then, and I'm staying close to Foucault's introduction, then a couple of things started to happen. First, Vietnam. So for the generation of people who grew up after the Second World War, that was the moment when the narrative of the good guys versus the bad guys seemed to be not so convincing anymore. Have you noticed, by the way, how we are always the good guys? Did you ever wonder, you know, how is that? You know, is everyone feeling the same?
No, I don't.
Or some people just decide to be the bad guys, you know, and like Iago in Shakespeare's Othello, they kind of wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be with a villain. Or is everybody doing that? The good guys write history? Yeah. But what about history that is not yet written? But that was the moment, according to Foucault, when the Western intellectual sort of started to doubt the goodness of this liberal democratic program through this liberal democracy beat Nazi Germany. So freed Europe from the atrocities of Nazism. But when you come to the moment of Vietnam War, it seems that actually it's not everything is so rosy, and this system itself has some kind of fascist tendencies within it. Yeah? Now, so what Foucault is referring to here is something that Karl Marx already identified about 100 years before Foucault, that revolutions tend to, Marx says something along the lines of every revolution plants the seeds of its own destruction. Yeah? And that's a very important thing to say. It means that when you make a political movement in order to defeat something you are against, some form of oppression you want to fight against, in order to conquer this oppression, in order to win, you need to mobilize various forces that later become themselves oppressive. Or in order to fight with oppression, you have yourself to become oppressive. So it's never the case of good against the bad, but in fighting the bad, you become bad. Yeah, I'm brutally simplifying it because I want you to think about it almost in terms of a kind of black and white. Yeah, it's really that simple. But it presents a massive problem to anyone who really wants to participate. Hello, and again, really sorry about today's condition. No chairs? There is a chair here.
Chair there.
Just steal from the chair. I hope you can still take notes, and I hope it will be recorded. So, if something today you can go over it.
Yeah. You need this chair. You can take my backpack off the table.
Is everyone okay? Okay, where were we? Can someone remind me? That presents a real problem to anyone who actually wants to create political change. Because if you end up in the same position of the forces you are fighting against, so what is the point? What should be your strategy? So Foucault suggests that this book is one of these strategies. But what is important is to kind of realize that these revolutions in Paris, the student riots or the demonstrations of 1967-68, that also echoed throughout Europe, in Germany, in Italy to a very large extent. The whole generation of people who were born after the war, who were in their 20s at that time, seemed to be kind of coming to the streets, especially the students of this generation, coming to the streets and just saying that they're not happy with this current democratic liberal system. And you were thinking, what not to like? You know, that it is a good system. But these revolts, they really compelled a whole generation of intellectuals to respond to what happened. And this is one of the most significant responses. Another very significant book that came out of this moment is Jean-Francois Lyotard's book. We read something of him earlier this year, Libidinal Economy. Another very interesting book, but I just consider the title, Libidinal Economy. Libido, desire, yeah? Economy, the economy of desire. Normally when people talk about economy, they talk about finance, something very calculable, mathematical, kind of hard. What Lyotard says in his book, the economy that really matters is desire. So desire is also can be thought of as an economy, and economy, both in terms of finance and in terms of logistics and organization, economy is also somehow implicated with desire. So Anti-Oedipus follows a similar trajectory, but with a slightly different emphasis. But this book, when it came out, it became overnight a phenomenal bestseller. Not only philosophers read it, every person in France read it. It was the book to read. It was a very massive cultural moment. Not least because it's written in a very particular way. You never before you read a book of philosophy written in that kind of language. People, even in the introduction, one of the ways this book is described is stone thinking. Stone thinking, yeah? So no book of philosophy previously was written like that, and it really changed the way people think about how philosophy can be done. And I think that from that moment onward, there is an idea that philosophy can be also fun, not only hard learning and logic, and following, terribly complex arguments, but it also can be exhilarating. It can be as gripping as reading a novel, as moving as reading a poem. The philosophy can do these things. So, what Foucault was saying is that this narrative of the Marxist, the Freudian, the semiotic narrative came to an end. And the problem with this narrative is not that it is necessarily wrong, but that it attempts to explain everything. It is a system, and as we see today, systems don't always work. And so, last week, we ended up talking about desire, and I think there was a kind of, we left it at the point when we were not completely clear what we are talking about, because somebody, I think, Vishal, you were saying, so couldn't desire as well be also used, for the same sort of fascist purposes? Of course, it's the whole point that when we look at Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, we see desire in a very intense form. But what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is, this is desire that is already harnessed into the Oedipal structure. This is desire that is already harnessed into the narrative of the Führer, of race, of domination, of fascism. And yes, and it becomes a destructive, dangerous force. What they try to find in this book is how to connect with desire that is not Oedipal, how to connect with desire that flows freely and not linked to the figure of the father, or castration, or lack, or insecurity, or low self-esteem. All these things that create the Oedipal subject. Things will become a little clearer after we also read a little bit of Freud, and you will see how all these things connect. So I understand that at the moment it might not be entirely clear to you what exactly this Oedipal thing we are talking about, but you just need to believe that we will fill these gaps. Yeah. But we touched on Oedipus a little bit last week, didn't we? We spoke about it briefly. Yeah. So what we're trying to learn, both as people who read Anti-Oedipus today and as artists, is how to let desire run amok through your artwork, not as an expression of the Oedipal syndrome, not as an expression of either subordination or oppression or following instruction or following a method, but how to allow desire run amok and flow freely in your artwork, yeah? And how to enable desire not to be connected to Oedipus. Or you can even say how to free desire from representation. You could, I think about it in that way. So with this in mind, sorry. Okay, I know we were already familiar with the first paragraph because it was part of one of the briefs. So now things kind of start to come together a little bit. But I still think it's worth, it is just good to hear it again. I think it's a nice way to get into the spirit of this thing. Could someone read to us the first paragraph? Huh? Who could you read to us? Until sorry.
Maybe it's
until I think we will need to read until here. One second, sorry.
It is at work everywhere.
Can you just do it a little bit louder? Yeah.
It is at work everywhere. Functioning smoothly at times, at other times it fits and starts. It breathes, it hits, it shits and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said it. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative ones. Machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines, with all the necessary techniques and connections. An organ machine is platted into an energy resource machine. The one produces a flow and the other is the root. The breast is a machine that produces milk, and the mouth machine coupled to it. The mouth, I'm sorry,
Am I on the way?
the mouth of a narrative way between several functions is possessor is uncertain as to whether it is an eating machine, an animal machine, a taking machine, or a breathing machine. As matter types.
I think that's enough. Yeah. So we read it before, and that was the first encounter you had with text of this kind. How does it sound to you today? What do you hear from these sentences? Sorry?
Contemporary.
It's contemporary. Why? The language. What do you think it is talking about?
That everything is connected with everything. Nothing can function without any other energy. There needs to be some kind of individual.
Everywhere it is machines. What does it mean? How do you understand this to say that everywhere it is machines? Everywhere? Everywhere? There is a provocation in that. I want you to hear the provocation very, very clearly. Normally, how would we say? We'll say, well, of course there are machines, but there is also nature. Of course there is culture, man-made, but there is also the natural world. Yeah? No one denies the existence of machines, but there are some things that are not machines. There are blades of grass, there are bees, there are trees, there are drops of water on the window, you know. There's also, you know, the beating heart inside the human being, you know. There are all these things which are not machines. And of course there are machines like the computer and the projector. But they say, no. They say all of the above, including the heart, including the blade of grass, all of that is machines. They are only machines. Only machines. There's nothing else. The sun is a machine, and a virus or a bacteria is a machine. You are a machine. You are a machine made of several machines, made of many machines. But also the plant on your windowsill is a machine. They are only machines. Why would someone want to say that? What do you think is to be gained in saying, or even put it differently? The question, the question is not so much are they right or are they wrong, because we can, of course, argue about it. The question is, how can you use that way of thinking? What does it allow you to do? So that's yes.
And because then you just focus on the process of each individual thing. So I think it's the driving force of everything, whether it's the plant to reach the light, or the bees to make honey, or us to do whatever our desires is. So I think you then focus outside of the end product and just the process that while you're even striving for that product.
That's nice. That's good. Did you hear that? Yeah, that's very nice. You didn't hear. Can you repeat that?
Rewind something. I don't know if I can say that. Okay.
You can do it. You can do it.
I was just saying that all things have a desire or a process to achieve or do something. So even like the bees, they want to make honey, or the plants want to reach the sunlight, so that's their process, the same for us. And so if we focus on the process instead of the end result, then that is the interesting, that is the journey.
So that you're saying that's what thinking machinistically allows you to do, focusing on the process. That's good. That's very good. What else that might what sort of metaphysics, or what kind of belief system will come out of this notion that everything is just machines. Simone.
Is it to go outside of your bodily limits?
And you spoke about the ego or the superego? Yeah, so exactly. I think that connects quite nicely with what you said earlier. How do you get out of your ego? How do you get out of the self? Answer. The machine, or considering yourself not as a identity, not as an ego, not as a formed and fixed entity that just goes through life more or less separately as an individual, but thinking machinistically allows you to forego the individual. The individual is not important. The individual is just a name we give to several machines connected together, but these connections all the time change. Yeah. So thinking machinistically allows us perhaps to trace the various connections we're making in real time, rather than considering some kind of idealized notion of the self. Yes. But the freedom always comes at a price, because there is no such thing as free lunch. And what is the price you pay for thinking machinistically like that?
Sanity.
Sorry?
Your sanity.
Your sanity. You know what? You might be right. You might be right. These are dangerous games. So, yeah. And a lot is at stake, especially for those who have to think it for the first time. For us, we really reap the benefits of very, very intense thinking that, for instance, drove Nietzsche to completely lose his mind. So people who thought these thoughts first, they really ventured into the deep unknown. We, following a little bit in their footsteps, benefit from the really heroic thinking they done. I think that is important. There is another thing. Maybe it's slightly connected to what to the notion of sanity. When your worldview is machinistic, there is no room there for what? Well, for one thing, there is really no room for God. If it is a machinistic world, if it is all machines, then really there is no God. That also means that notions like good and bad seem kind of redundant. Machines don't have any concept of good and bad. Machines do what machines do. Yeah. So.
Discussing the Heidegger text, that you know, seeing nature in a different way, being part of nature and then not seeing nature as a resource, technique for
Yes, good, very good.
Here.
You didn't hear?
No.
Could you repeat that, Natalia?
It's just saying that there's a connection with have been discussing in the Heidegger text about seeing nature and in another way, not as a resource, but being part of nature. That's poiesis and technique happens at the same time.
So everything is a machine. Nature, what we call nature, is also machinistic aggregates, because a leaf is a plant. What is a plant? Isn't that interesting that the plant in English is both the yucca and the factor. A plant is a factor, isn't it? So the plant is also a factor. Of course it's a factor. It deals with energy. It stores energy, consumes energy. Yeah? That's what plants do. So So we spoke about this example in the a while ago, but I just want to look at it again. An organ machine plugged into an energy source machine. The one produces a flow that the other interrupts. So the breast is a machine that produces milk, and the mouth, a machine coupled to it. So here is a way to think about, let's say, mother-child relationship, not in terms of two subjective entities, but in terms of a machine. One part of the machine is producing milk, and another part is sucking the milk. And this is a machinistic aggregate. So what Deleuze and Guattari ask us to identify is the flow of the milk. It's only the flow of the milk that really that matters here. And what we call the baby's mouth or the mother's breast, these are just the mechanisms that facilitate this flow. But this flow that we are talking about is essential for pleasure, for life. Yeah? The newborn baby, they suggest, needs simultaneously nourishment and pleasure. The two things are directly connected. If there was no pleasure in the milk, then how would you even know that you will eat? So there has to be both the utility and the pleasure completely connected. Doesn't it remind you the way Heidegger talks about technology? How in technology he says the poetic and the mechanical, the instrumental and the poetic are deeply linked and connected. Yeah? So here we have this Deleuze and Guattari working with a similar idea. But they try to suggest that we need to find ways to free desire from these Oedipal frameworks. That's why the example of the baby or the child and the mother is so important, because the Freudian interpretation of it would be that this is the moment when the newborn, when the infant or the newborn is needing the milk and suckling the milk. The moment, let's say, the baby is hungry and the milk is not coming or the mother is not there, that causes a trauma, and therefore, the first trauma that each one of us has, according to Freud, you know which one it is? You don't know it? It's the oral trauma. The oral trauma, the oral phase, according to Freud, is something that happens around 4 months, 6 months, 7 months, but around this time, when the newborn baby is a few months old, and the oral trauma is linked to this desire to suckle, and when one day the breast is not coming, either because it's time to wean the child or for various reasons, then what happened? Until now, everything was good. You wanted to eat, you had food. It was just sort of available. One day it's not available, so you start to cry. You start to cry, and then you maybe get something. So you learn how to manipulate. You learn how to use your mouth, not only to get the food and the nourishment, but also to express yourself. And this problem, according to Freud, is not managed well. This person will grow up with an unresolved oral trauma. Not every one of us has this trauma, but with some people, if it was not managed well, they're still attached to various activities that relate to sucking, smoking, chewing, biting nails, all these behaviors. You know, to those of you who will run from this room, you know, for a cigarette break, that is the reason. So that's Freud. Yeah. Now, I know it's hilarious, isn't it? It is very funny.
What about the anal? When you talk about the anal?
We talk about everything. The first trauma, the oral trauma, happens at this age of few months. Yeah, it is connected with the mouth. The second trauma, you're right, Simona, is connected to the anus. That happens a little bit later, because in the beginning, the baby, you know, when it needs to defecate, just does it in the sink, and everyone's so happy. So, oh, lovely baby, great. And everyone is absolutely delighted. And then it goes on until one day they say, "Bad baby, what have you done? You need to go to the toilet. You cannot just go like this." So again, you have to imagine how frustrating that must be, because everything was okay until now, and everyone loved your food, and suddenly they don't like it, and they say, "No, keep it in. To lynch your butterscotches, keep it in until the right moment, when you are in the right place, and then you can do it." So when the baby is small, again, I have to keep reminding you, this is in Freud. Yeah? When the baby is small, the only thing it can give as a present, or in return for all the good care and affection that is showered upon them, they can only give their food. And they give it with abundance. They give it and they give it and they give it. And everyone loves the food. Yeah? Because what is nicer than the food of a newborn baby? Until one day, they don't want it anymore. So your present is no good. It's returned back to you, and you get hungry. So that's how the anal trauma can be formed. And in this moment, and when the child needs to learn that you cannot just go poo wherever, but you need to behave in a social acceptable way, at this moment, this entity really becomes a social creature that learns what is allowed and what is not allowed. Because before then, there was no question. You just did what you had to do in the city. It was not completely outside any kind of regulation. And suddenly, you need to learn when it is okay and when it's not okay. You become a social agent. You become a subject. Yeah? That's connected with the anal stage. Some people really cannot get over it, and they really must keep giving the world their food or their shit. And these people are known as artists. That's what artists do. Artists they keep thinking that their shit is so lovely, and it's smelling so good, and it's so aromatic, that they just want to keep giving it. So, now you know. We didn't finish, because there is also the third trauma, the Oedipal trauma, and that happens a little bit later. That happens around the age of puberty. It's different between men and women, and Freud mostly discussed it both about men and women. If you are interested, there are two fantastic essays, The Rat Man, about this moment in boys, and a really great essay, A Child is Being Beaten, about the sadomasochistic fantasies in girls of that age, of puberty. Two really great essays. A child is being beaten. A child, yeah. And that is, in this book, in this essay, Freud is noticing that many adolescent girls at the age of puberty, have dreams of fantasies around watching a child being punished, whipped or beaten, or something like that. And that is a discussion of how this fantasy relates to the Oedipal trauma. And the Oedipal trauma relates to the moment when the child is already a fully formed ego, but now it looks around, the child is looking around and sees that actually, you know, if you really want to have fun, then you want to take your daddy's place, and that might involve, you know, killing your daddy or just being better. So again, if this stage is poorly managed, there will be trouble. If this stage is well managed by the parents and the environment, then the trauma might not be dominant. Then you might develop a sense of self which is not constantly threatened, which is not constantly feeling in sort of mortal danger, and you might be a well-adjusted human being. But if your age of puberty was poorly managed, if, for instance, you were not given progressively more responsibilities, or if you were given too many responsibilities, if you were never, if let's say your parents did not really allow you to develop independence, but keep treating you as if you are a little baby when you are already not a baby, then you might have a trauma around your sense of self that will be very difficult to get rid of and carry you through life. If, for instance, you were bullied by your parents, by the family, in school, then the chances are that this person will grow up with a very damaged ego. So they will need to prove themselves all the time. They will need to be the loudest in the room. They will need to, you know, be the biggest and wave their hands the widest, you know, and all of this kind of, and you know what I'm talking about. There is this kind of behavior of exaggerated aggression, and very noticeable in men. Often you can even just see it when you go on tube, for instance. And that, according to Freud, this behavior is a compensatory mechanism for feeling incredibly fragile and insecure. And this insecurity is coming from this moment of growing up not being properly managed by the parents. Yeah? So I'm just giving you in a sort of thumbnail sketch the Freudian theory of growth and development. Yeah? That's also why therapy is such a lucrative business. Because according to Freud, everyone has these traumas. You could not escape. You could not escape the oral phase, you could not escape the anal phase, you could not escape the Oedipal phase. So everyone has a trauma. For some people it is so huge that it takes over their life and they really need extensive treatment. For others, the damage may be limited, but in a sense, there is no one who gets out of childhood unharmed. No one gets unscathed. And this is the very principle of the Freudian theory of adult development. Any questions so far? Any of that was familiar to you? A little bit, yeah? Because you know these expressions, you know, anal fixation, oral fixation, they will talk about it quite a lot. It is very much in the popular, in the everyday culture. But I strongly recommend that you read some Freud, It's very fun, great fun to read, and because it's so foundational in the way our society operates. But it's very rare that Freud is taught in schools or even on undergraduate courses. My advice is to have a look. It very much depends what aspect. Freud is several things. He's a doctor who specializes in neurosis, in nerves, neurasthenia. He's a philosopher who is writing about the human condition and kind of the existential condition of being human. He is also a political writer who writes about the rise of fascism, for instance, in the book Society and Its Discontents. So it kind of, sorry? Civilization and its discontents. Thank you very much. Civilization and its discontents. So it depends what aspect of Freud, but the interpretation of dreams, his main book, is fantastic. But I think probably the best way is just to get one of the Freud readers. Penguin has a Freud reader, which is a selection of key texts. So that gives you a lot of short pieces. We can find something that will be. So with that in mind, you can see what Deleuze and Guattari are doing here when they say, forget the oral phase. You can think about these things in a different way. Perhaps not everything can be explained by reducing it to these three functions. You know, maybe not every time, maybe not every time you smoke a cigarette, it is, you know, this oral fixation. Maybe sometimes it's just because you want the pleasure of smoking, you know. And because once you start thinking in this Freudian way, with these three phases and chromas, you can identify them everywhere, all the time. Yeah. Every action of, you know, keeping something, not wanting to give, it's able. Every time you put something in your mouth, it's oral. You know, every time there is a envy or jealousy or authority, it's Oedipus. Yeah. So it becomes incredibly reductive. Everything is one thing. So you look at a child play, for instance, and the child is playing with a train and with a tunnel. So obviously, you know, the Freudian reading will be, this is the, you know, the fear of frustration. The child, you know, is worried about losing his penis, you know. But not every time a train enters a tunnel, it is a penis entering a vagina. Sometimes it's just a train and a tunnel, you know. That's one way to understand that. So the attempt here is not only to propose a world without God, because it's just a world made of machines, but it's also a world without Oedipus. So I told you all these stories, so all the story of Freud. So when we keep talking about Oedipus, you have in mind that Oedipus is connected with questions of authority and domination, because on some level, Oedipus is a rebellion to the authority of the parent. Yeah? Until a certain age, you don't question the authority of your parents. But at some point, maybe around the age of 8, 10, or 12, and maybe also different between boys and girls, you start to question this authority. Suddenly you start to compare yourself to one of the parents. You want to become like them, wear their clothes, drive their cars. And that is somehow incredibly important in order to understand how, for instance, a fascist system of oppression is there. Okay? So let's So, what about the next page? So, could someone read to us this paragraph, just starting from here? What the schizophrenia, I want you to start to understand why Deleuze and Guattari bring in the notion of schizophrenia and what exactly they're saying. I think it's quite interesting. Could someone read? Perhaps up with you. Could somebody to us?
What the schizophrenic experiences, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not at all any one specific aspect of nature, but nature as a process of production. What do we mean here by process? It is probable that at a certain level, nature and industry are two separate and distinct things. From one point of view, industry is the opposite of nature. From another, industry extracts its raw materials from nature. From yet another, it returns its refuse to nature, and so on.
Okay, stop here for a second. How do you understand what is said here? Okay. Can you, Simona, read it one more time? Instead of schizophrenia, no, instead of schizophrenic, read artist. Now I want you to listen to that again, and let's see if we can make sense of it.
What the artist experiences.
Can you start again? And can you make it a little bit louder, because I think this is key. So pick up your ears.
What the artist experiences, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not at all any one specific aspect of nature, but nature is a process of production. What do we mean here by process? It is probable that at a certain level, nature and industry are two separate and distinct things. From one point of view, industry is the opposite of nature. From another, industry extracts its raw materials from nature. From yet another, it returns refuse to nature, and so on.
And read a little bit further.
Even within society, this characteristic, man nature, industry nature, society nature, relationship algorithm, is responsible for the distinction of relatively autonomous spheres that are called production, distribution, consumption. But in general, this entire level of...
Okay, stop here. Just start from here, for the real truth.
For the real truth of the fixed elements within an overall...
No, for the real truth of the matter.
For the real truth of the matter, the glaring sober truth that resides in delirium is that there is no such thing as relatively independent spheres of circuits. Production is immediately consumption, and a recording process and registering without any sort of mediation, and the recording process and consumption directly determine production.
Fantastic. Did you hear that? I was trying to highlight it. Okay, so what the artist experiences, did it make more sense when we read it as an artist? By the way, this is such a useful tool. When you're reading a text, you need to make it speak to you about your practice. To just replace a noun or a verb with what you are investigating and then see what kind of insight it affords, if it allows you to move your practice forward. So what we are told here, and it's not because I'm suggesting that an artist has to be schizophrenic, and that's also not what Deleuze and Guattari are suggesting. When they're talking about the schizophrenic, they don't try to glorify mental illness. Schizophrenia as a mental illness is a nasty, nasty disease that causes untold misery and suffering. They're not saying, oh, how great it is if we would just be all completely mad, suddenly, would be so the world would be a better place. They're saying that there is something in the way the schizophrenic mind operates with the reality that we can use in order to make sense in a different way. So it's quite important that I'm not saying, let's just, be mad and just make bad artworks, go crazy. They're saying there is a certain method in schizophrenia that we can learn from and use. Very, very different from saying, let's all go mad. But at the moment, that's not important. What is important is that they are saying here something about the artist, because we replaced the word. And what is it? What is the experience of the artist? The process. So here they kind of show what is at stake in artistic production. Was the artist experience both as an individual and as a member of human species is not at all any one specific aspect of nature, but nature as a process of production. So for instance, when we talk about a plant being a plant, being a machine, this is already schizophrenic way of thinking. And none of us became sort of ill. You see what I mean? So I want it to be absolutely clear. It's not that you don't see it. Say it again.
The last part, about the schizophrenia.
Well, what are you not sure about?
About how that process is schizophrenia.
Well, they say the experience of a person of a schizophrenia is to see the world in terms of processes. So, after that I said, so whenever we talk about experience in terms of process, we already use this schizophrenic thinking. But you don't need to really have to develop schizophrenia. There is a method in this way of thinking. And it doesn't matter if it is really clinically correct, that's how a person with schizophrenia sees the world. It doesn't matter. This is not a medical essay. This is not an essay about mental illness. So the notion of schizophrenia here, I'm sorry to say, is a metaphor. I'm sorry to say because Deleuze and Guattari kind of tried to get rid of metaphors.
I think you could also replace the word with
With?
Bipolar.
You could maybe you could replace it even with dementia. It's for you to play with. What they basically want to do. This little text wants to perform a certain task. It wants to suggest that one way to look at the world is in terms of all the separate objects in the world. So we can look at the table. This is our world at the moment, and we can describe it. And if I will ask you to describe this table as a sort of creative writing exercise, you might want to describe it in terms of the objects on the table. Yeah? So then I will start my essay by saying there is a book on this table, and then there is another book, and there is a pen, and there is a notebook, there is a coffee cup, there is a water bottle, there is a phone, and we can go and do and describe all these things. That will be the kind of normal, or what Deleuze and Guattari call the Oedipal way of thinking. It's the Oedipalized way of thinking, because everything is expressed from the perspective of the individual that also identifies objects in the world as individuals, as separate, right? There is, however, they say, another way of engaging with the world, another way of looking at the world, which is not from the perspective of objects, but from the perspective of processes that can manifest themselves as objects. But really, an object is just a somehow solidification of a process. So, for instance, this water bottle, we can look at it from the perspective of the bottle and how much water it has, but we can also look at it from the perspective of the process that starts from perhaps some oil. Yeah, I don't know from what this bottle might be made from, maybe other bottles, or maybe oil that we take from the ground, and the process formed this bottle. But there is also a process that takes this bottle towards the landfill and makes it into something else. Yeah? So we could also describe what we have here on the table, not from the perspective of the things or objects on the table, but from the perspective of all the processes that operate. Does it make sense?
I think it's interesting because for cultures who do not believe in...
Can you be a bit louder? Or maybe can't put, no.
It's interesting because for cultures who don't believe in schizophrenia or mental illness, the process is within themselves.
Yes.
So there's a disconnection or a problem with equilibrium within the self. So the process is as the individual, which is quite opposite.
And when you say the process is within themselves, what do you mean?
So there's an imbalance within their entire system, both spiritually and physically and metaphysically. You could be possessed, for example, and then that is affecting you, but it's all about you. So it's almost like exaggerating the Oedipus.
So you are saying that you are saying that this notion of looking at the world from the perspective of things is quite maybe historically and geographically and politically located within the Western way of thinking. Good, yeah, that's exactly the point I'm making. And they're coming back to it. It's a big book. They have a whole chapter on that kind of criticizes anthropological thinking, and you find that interesting, Ebony, and that is the Savages, Barbarians, Civilized Men. It's chapter 3. It's very excellent. So here are two ways to basically look at anything in the world, either from the perspective of the thing, or from the perspective of the process that produces the thing, or the thing itself as a process. Yeah? So not from the perspective, you can look at the newborn baby from the perspective of this, here look, a little tiny human being, a tiny individual that will grow and become a big individual. That's one way. Or another way is to say this is part of this machine that manages the flow of milk. Yeah? And that is not about an individual, but about a machine that will, after a certain point, disintegrate and will become another machine. The machine that produces milk will become a machine that produces food. So the machine that suckles milk will become a machine that produces food. And
this is an example
nature as a process
Of
that's evidence that nature as a process.
nature as a process, exactly, yeah. So they say in order to see nature as a process of production, you need to take something from this schizophrenic way of thinking. But again, I was not tired telling you, this is not an invitation to go mental. Yeah? It's almost the other way around. It's always saying the schizophrenic in this, the schizophrenic mindset, the schizophrenic worldview maintains something valued, truthful, real about the world. Now, there is a movement that Deleuze and Guattari are in correspondence with. It's called anti-psychiatry or anti-psychiatry. In France, there was a clinic that Guattari worked. And in this clinic treated people with mental illnesses, but their approach was anti-psychiatry, or they're generally known as anti-psychiatry. So it's very interesting. One of the aspects of the way this clinic operates, the philosophy behind it was that you can create such conditions for a person with mental illness that their mental illness will stop being an obstacle for them to live a fulfilling life. Yeah? If you create, very often people with mental illness find it incredibly difficult to function in the society that we consider normal, which is hierarchical, regulated, with very determined structures. But you could create a society which is less hierarchical, less rigid, in which a person that cannot function in a rigid society will feel themselves more at home. That is also quite relevant to what Evan was saying earlier. There are some societies that just don't believe in mental illness. Yeah? In this clinic, on the outskirts of Paris, one of the principles was that everyone in the clinic performs all the maintenance tasks of the clinic. So in the morning, all the doctors and the nurses and the patients and the managers would come together and would divide all the responsibilities for the day. Some people will do the cleaning job, some will do the shopping, some will do the food, some will do the bed, without any distinction between who is the patient and who is the doctor. Yeah? So just one example how the attempt was to create an environment in which your behavior stops being an obstacle for functioning. And part of the principle was creating a more horizontal society in this microcosmos of the clinic. More horizontal, less hierarchical. Yeah? So in England, there was another very famous practitioner of anti-psychiatry, R.D. Laing. You heard of him?
Yes.
Did you read his poems, the Knots book?
No, let me read the
If you haven't read R and D, two letters, R.D. Laing. Yeah, it's just R.D. Laing. L-A-M-I. L-A-I-N-G. Yeah. So his book of poems, Knots, is really interesting. But so this just gives you an idea that it is also possible to organize, to look at reality in a different way. That's what we are working on. So
we can look at the schizophrenic experiences and processes, like compared, as we often done, to Newtonian and quantum physics, in a way that Newtonian physics explain the world exactly as a table or whatever, as an object, and they provide a certain kind of view of the world that works and is correct. And then when we look at quantum physics, it accommodates way more things than the Newtonian physics, and allows is almost like a schizophrenic, because I looked up at the etymology of the word schizophrenic, and it means the split mind. And if we split the mind, it kind of loses the individual identity. It becomes really arbitrary, and that's why, for example, the identity does not accommodate for all these other models, like schizophrenic or dementia or bipolar. But if we think, if we split the mind, this framework accommodates all these possibilities, and that's why looking at the world in this schizophrenic way doesn't mean necessarily in the way of mental illness, but on a sub-individual level.
Did you hear that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was very, very nicely put. So here you have two ways, as Darius says, of grasping the world. You can grasp the world through the Newtonian physics, or you can grasp the world through quantum physics. Yeah? But just the idea that two ways are possible is already kind of quite mind-blowing. Because before, you could do everything with just the one key. Suddenly, reality is too big for just the one key. You need two keys, maybe more. Yeah? You need a quantum key and you need a Newtonian key. Because even though we have quantum physics, and your phone, your smartphone, would not be possible without quantum physics, if you're going to build a bridge, you still need Newton. If you're going to fire a cannonball and you want to know where it lands, you still need Newton. But if you want to build a smartphone, Newton is not enough. You need quantum physics. Yeah? So that's interesting, yeah? Reality is suddenly much bigger than we thought it is. Because it became like a layered cake. If first we thought that it just, let's say, help me here, a cake with one layer. You know, like a carrot cake. No, carrot cake also has two layers. But what is the name of, let's say, a cake you make in a tea?
Plum cake?
Plum cake. Yeah, so Newtonian physics, Newtonian world is a pancake. Yeah? Suddenly we have a whole stack of pancakes. Yeah? And each one requires a completely different set of rules. Very good. Who's a pancake? So here is a kind of philosophy for a complex world, for a world with complexity. So what the artist experiences, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not one aspect of nature, but the processes and the flows that operate. So it is this shift from the identities to processes, from things to flows. Can you hear here echoes of Heidegger's essay about the thing? But he also said, you can look at this judge from two perspectives. Either, he would say, inauthentically, non-authentically, from the perspective of science, or authentically, from the perspective of this judge's existence. So, Deleuze and Guattari also make a kind of similar call, and they say, if you just look at the world, if you just look at this table from the perspective of the things on it, it is inauthentic. You're only dealing with surface effects. You need to deal with the flows and the processes. And interestingly, the moment you start dealing with flows and processes, this table becomes incredibly political. Because suddenly it is an expression of various power relations, production relations. Then you suddenly have to ask, well, who actually made this water bottle? Because someone was standing there at the origin of the process, where some molten lava, in the plastic lava, was poured into, I don't know, how they're made. So you need to go and find out. Before you can describe what you have at this table, you kind of need to start asking yourself all these complex questions. And then where does it end? Everything then is connected. So it's isn't that also quite an interesting insight about an artwork, a possibility of an artwork that is interested more with processes than with surface effects, processes of production, processes that produce entities, and the various stories and narratives that make them into these forms. But the forms are kind of only transient because the process is continuous. And you are noting, because I think it does sound a little bit like well, non-traditional approach to medicine. Yeah? For instance, it's interesting that in shiatsu, which I already mentioned, there is a lot of emphasis on flows of energy through the body. And that could be the lymphatic liquids in your body, that could be urine, and one of the central notions is that if these flows get blocked, you're going to have pains and problems. So what the therapist will try to do is to make sure that the flow, that everything flows as smoothly as possible. The lymphatic liquid, for instance, you know what it is, in your body is not getting, let's say, accumulated in some areas, and so and then the massage or the treatment is concerned with facilitating flows, which is a very different approach from, let's say, Western medicine, when we might say, okay, I have a pain in my elbow, let's have a painkiller for the elbow. Yeah? The shiatsu approach would be, well, where is the flow that can, let's say, congeal here, and then might, the area of treatment might be very different from the elbow. It might be, for instance, in the shoulder. It could be that it's somehow connected like this. Does it make sense? Okay. So the real truth of the matter, the glaring, sober truth, now that is a good term of phrase, the sober truth resides in delirium. That should make you laugh. The sober truth resides in delirium. Okay. Is that there is no such thing as relatively independent spheres or circles. There is no, how do you understand this sentence, that there is no such thing as relative independence? How do you understand it in relation to yourself, to your practice, to anything you like, to the news? Yes. What does it mean to you as to your own being?
It could be like, if something happens to you, something that I know, maybe I can feel some energy that can affect me in a different way. Or even if something that I don't know, because it's going to affect my life in a certain way.
That's right. That's right. I think it can go deeper than that. Further, on the level of production, because everything is involved in the process of production, there is no real boundary between, for instance, me and you, or this table, or this building. We are connected through various processes. So the notion I have of my own independence from you and my own autonomy is an illusion. On social level, we sort of understand it. Yeah, we understand that we are not only individuals, but also belong to society, and that's why we have laws and all these kind of things. But that also, on all other levels, it's also true. There is no sense in which I have any kind of autonomy, any kind of self. If by self we understand something that is independent, subjective. Yeah. So the notion of here I am and here you are, and then I can treat you as an object, or I can make a picture of you because you are out there. That Deleuze and Guattari say is a false idea. And if you're going to, if your art will deal with, let's say, the person in front of you or the bottle in front of you as an object is separate from you, that's not going to be art. Or that's not going to be schizophrenia. Or that's not going to say anything about this complex quantum world. What you want is to consider the world in terms of processes and not in terms of subjectivities and identities. And it's enough to really walk into a contemporary art space like Tate Modern to see that these ideas are at work in many art forms, and actually they are already there in your work as well. All you need to do is just to see that that's what you've been already doing. Okay, so any questions so far? Any thoughts? Are we going too slowly? Or should we? They want to move a little bit faster. You okay? And how about people over there? Are you? Can you see the screen? All right. Great. Great. Okay. So shall we say we come back at is it 10 past 12? Shall we come back at 20 past? It's okay, just and we need to figure out what kind of politics comes with this possibility. What kind of art is this way of thinking can make possible? So Dario made an excellent remark saying it's just like quantum physics next to Newtonian physics. Two ways to explain the world. As the world expands, one model is not enough. So here, two models with which to look at the world. The world is made of objects or entities or egos, or the world as process. The world as made of processes. It would be interesting, for instance, to see how that maps onto your practice when you install. So if I can tell the story of your induction into the course, if you'll forgive me for being quite crude with that. When a student appears on this course, then they bring their own individual work and they treat it as this kind of self-contained practice. And then we start installing together and we work in the install on identifying flows between different works. Yeah? And the more we can facilitate flows or identify connections, two things happen. On the one hand, we disrupt this invisible eggshell around this individual artwork and start, it's almost like plugging it into other works. Yeah? So on one hand, the work loses its identity as an individual. On the other, it acquires an additional of its already existing dimension that relates to its process, becomes more visible because the flows between this work and that work get explored. But it's the same work, yeah? get this, it's the same work. You can look at it from the perspective of its individuality or from the perspective of its interconnectedness. Did you want to ask something? On some level, it is not so complicated to look at yourself as an individual, which is completely separate from everyone else, or you could see how you are part of a family, or a tribe, or a state, or any kind of formation. Yeah? It's not hard to imagine a situation in which your connections, for whatever reason, become more significant or more important than individuality. Yeah, but there are always these two possibilities. Just as you can see yourself, on one hand, as part of the process through which your family perpetuates, or your state, or your tribe, or your religion, or whatever. So you can also look at each thing from the perspective of the processes it is taking part in. Yeah? So what Deleuze and Guattari suggest, I mean, it would be a very interesting speculation, and kind of thanks for sharing, as they say, and that's it. But the point that they are making is that this is politically important, and this is important artistically. The suggestion here is that there is a certain way of existing as an artist and as a producer, because artist is producer, yeah? Artists make things. There is a way of making that coming out of this understanding, and there is a politics that coming out of this understanding. Okay. Any questions? So, I want to go to page 4. And could someone read to us this section that starts with second? What was the first? So the first we saw that, and also notice that before we move on, this is quite interesting. Production is immediately consumption and the recording process. So there is no such thing as relatively independent spheres and circles. That you could understand it as saying, for instance, the image is not independent from the thing it images. Yeah? You are not independent from the group of the people you study. But also, the image is not independent from the frame. The image is not independent from the space that it is in. Yeah? That interconnected. That's why we install work and don't just put it on the wall. Because when you put something in the frame on the wall, you kind of suggest that the wall doesn't matter. The space doesn't matter. Here is the wall. But if you see the wall as interconnected, linked with everything, then if you put it on that wall, or on that wall, or on the floor, or next to something, everything is changing. Because the meaning emerging out of these interconnectedness. Yeah? But equally, production is not separate from consumption, but it's one process. And that also means that any kind of binary opposition you used to think with has to be rethought in terms of connectedness. Black is not opposite of white, but black and white are interconnected. Black is always becoming white. White is always becoming black. Male is not separate from female, but is connected. Yes? The female and the male are not opposites, but the male is already becoming female. Female is always becoming male. That's an interesting way of thinking, for instance, about gender politics. Yeah, because it puts the emphasis not so much on what you are, but what potentials you have to become, what potentialities you have to transform yourself. You know, maybe you really have a potential to become an artist. Yeah, maybe that is why you are here, because you are engaged in this process of becoming. If there was no becoming, if you know, then how would change happen? How would you move from being an accountant, a teacher, a pig farmer, a songwriter? How do you move from that to something else? So what Deleuze and Guattari are saying that if you look at the process, things become possible in a different way. Yeah? They suggest that we try to stop thinking in terms of binary opposition. For instance, Rupert, that's where I think will be interesting to bring your previous remark, theory is always already practice. Practice is always already theory. Yeah? So the way of thinking in terms of theory and practice, or theory or practice, what is this? Is it theory or is it practice? Well, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's neither, it's both. The book, what is this book? It is of course a book of theory, but it's also the practice of this theory, which is the book. Yeah? So is that an art object? Yes, it is an art object. Is it a book of philosophy? Yes, it is a book of philosophy. Now, back to you. Look at your art. Is it an art object, or is it an object of theory? It's both. It's a theory that is becoming an object. It is an object that is becoming a concept. And that's exactly what your work, in a sense, captures. The becoming of the object. Yeah? Good. Okay. So then we go to the second part. But you see, I think there is a real pleasure in taking a sentence like this and just saying that actually it speaks about something which is kind of relevant, that's directly relatable in terms of work, in terms of practice, and for that reason, there is a kind of desire in the text itself. And yesterday I was listening to a program on the radio on BBC 4. It was about mathematics and about the beauty of mathematics. And someone was saying how, when you take a very complex formula, like let's say Maxwell's formulas, and you reduce them and you show the whole complex circulation takes you from Maxwell to Einstein, and how in the end you can have a whole blackboard full of equations, and in the end you just get this incredibly succinct E equals mc squared. It is such an overwhelming sense of beauty that you people to sit down, and catch their breath, because it is really a magnificent performance. But in taking a sentence or a paragraph from the book and really reading it, and really seeing how the voice, really making the voice that speaks with hair, I think there is also a kind of a very similar beauty, which is not to say that that must be correct or right. Now the question is whether it works for you. But there is definitely something in the way the text itself operates that makes it look like a work of art. Or for instance, in saying that the sober truth that resides in the living. Only an artist can say that. Do you hear? Do you understand why? Okay, so who could read? Would someone like to read first? Yes, Lisa.
Second, we make no distinction between man and nature. The human essence of nature and the natural essence of man become one within nature in the form of production or industry, just as they do within the life of man as a species. Industry is then no longer considered from the extrinsic point of view of utility, but rather from the point of view of its fundamental identity with nature as production of man and by man. Not man.
Let's stop here for a second. How do you understand what we read so far? So what does it mean? Second, okay. We remember what was the first, yeah? Second, we make no distinction between man and nature. The human essence of nature and the natural essence of man become one within nature in the form of production or industry, just as they do within the life of man as a species. How do you understand this sentence? What does it mean to say we make no distinction between man and nature?
That it's connected.
It means what kind of distinction they want you to abandon.
Separation.
Sorry?
The separation
Between?
between nature and man.
And how we normally refer to that separation? Nature and culture. Exactly. Is this distinction between nature and culture. Yeah? And they say there is no distinction. All nature is culture. All culture is nature. And who installed a couple of weeks ago this video footage of the trees? But she's not here. Okay, it's a shame that she's not here. Because that was something that we discussed in relation to her installation. Now in this, she had this quite dreamy, long shot, and she would describe it much better than me. Kind of looked at the canopy of some trees, you know. And then we got into this discussion about how, you know, no matter how stirring and moving these trees are, and how, you know, how much you feel the dew or the blades of grass under your feet, this is already culture. Yeah? Going into the forest is not delivering yourself to nature. Yeah? Nature is an object of culture. Nature is an object of culture. But equally, culture is a natural object. Culture is equally a natural object. So remember we spoke earlier about the binary oppositions. You know, there is no black or white. There is no consumption first or production first, consumption later. It's all interconnected process. Just as the newborn that's suckling the milk and then defecating is just this one flow, one process, so it is with nature and culture. Why is that important? Because normally, traditionally, in the position they argue against, there is this little word or nature or culture. Yeah? And so often, you know, so often a moral argument will start to say, oh, this is just not natural. You know, a lot of human behavior can be criminalized or punished by saying that it is not natural.
So is culture natural, is culture human behavior? What is it in that?
What is
Culture.
What is culture?
In the sense.
Well, they say the distinction itself is completely wrong. They say don't think in terms of nature or culture. Try to think in terms of processes. Because what it allows you to do, the question is not whether it is more correct to think in terms of processes than in terms of objects or oppositions. The question is what it allows you to do. Quantum physics is not more correct than Newtonian physics. Both are true, but they do different things. Yeah. So this is not an argument for a better theory. It's an argument for another way of doing things. So the question is, if we stop thinking in terms of culture versus nature, we might arrive at a different way of looking at things and a different way of doing things. Because the emphasis then is placed on processes that operate in both spheres. And because the same processes operate in both the cultural sphere and the natural sphere, it is the same sphere. The same flows of energy, both in nature and in culture. Energy gets stored, sometimes in a leaf, or sometimes in a battery. But they say it doesn't matter, it's the same process. Yeah? It doesn't answer the question. Not so? So maybe we can say it again? What?
I just wondered what culture in this specific context means.
Well, we make no distinction between man and nature. There is no. They say there is no distinction between nature and culture. So there is no point asking what culture means, because I mean there is a point in asking that, but the answer will be culture is a process. Nature is also a process. What's more, it's essential. Well, on some level, it's the same process.
No, that's what I was.
Yeah.
It was just not.
Sorry?
It was just not the
Yeah.
What a lot of philosophy points, if you take considering animals, the whole idea started for us to consider
Was it?
the idea
Of keeping things separate, or what they did?
a lot of philosophy.
Which one?
For example, when we talk things we talk about from the center.
Yes.
I asked about how about animals, how about cats, and they didn't consider animals, they didn't take account.
Okay.
So I guess
Sorry?
Oh, we can't hear, sorry.
It is really difficult. It is very noisy. You've got a proper voice here. Could you say it again a little louder?
yeah, I was saying that it's interesting that we talk about nature and man, because for all of philosophical points, if you take account into animals, the whole idea starts to fall apart because it doesn't apply to animals.
I think you are right. And recently, for at least the last 20 years, there is a whole area of philosophy that is focused on animals. And Derrida is one of the recent philosophers who wrote about it. And so there is quite a lot of work. And if that interests you, then you could read in the class some very interesting texts.
Especially related to fascism.
Lynn is great, yes. Sorry?
I said especially with fascism and animals.
Yes.
I think it's really related to
Yes, I think that's going to be very interesting. And actually, Deleuze and Guattari often go to animals for to explain some of their ideas. We might be able to see a little bit of it later. But notice this, that industry is no longer considered from the point of view of utility, but rather from the point of view of fundamental identity with nature. So, Julie, that could be an answer to what you asked. Industry or culture, or whatever human activity is on an essential level is fundamentally identical with nature. So the question is, as I said earlier, not whether this is right or wrong, because right or wrong, but also that's already one of these binaries we are trying to get away from. The question is, how can you work with this notion? How can you take it to the shop? How can you take it to your studio? How can you take it to your practice? What does it make possible? Yeah. So let's move on to this. I think it gets a bit here. So Julie, could you read to us the section that starts from "this is the second meaning of process"? I will scroll up.
This is the second meaning of process, as we use the term. Man and nature are not like two opposite terms confronting each other, not even in the sense of bipolar opposites within a relationship of causation, ideation, or expression, cause and effect, subject and object, etc. Rather, they are one and the same essential reality, the producer-product.
Great. Interesting, the producer is the product. The product is the producer. So there's no, they don't want you to think in terms of, here I am, and this is the artwork. They say, you are the artwork. The artwork is you. What does it mean? It means that your process of working is the artwork. Yes? Makes sense? So what we are doing here, we are kind of, do you remember being a child and having a loose tooth? Or sometimes it's not even loose, but you want it to be loose. So you start pulling it like this, and it's painful, but also quite enjoyable for some reason. And you go, and then you start feeling this, and then at some point, you can just take it off. That's what we are doing with this notion of objects or binary oppositions, good, bad, subject, object, cause and effect. These things are so deeply ingrained that there is kick, we chew our reality with these concepts. And now with you, we start to kind of gently move it, move it up a little bit, and it is slightly unsettling, but also a little bit seductive. And when you move away, something else can come instead. So once we remove this binary way of thinking, what might come beneath, from underneath, is the solution of the process. Yeah? So we dismantle binary thinking. Are you familiar with the term binary? What is binary? This is absolutely essential. Binary, from what word? From what word? Right. What that means? Binary is thinking in oppositions. What Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that we are trained from the very beginning to think in oppositions. And the Oedipal complex or the Oedipal trauma is in a sense the one manifestation of this kind of thinking. Binary thinking is always at work when you say on the one hand, on the other, black or white, male or female, gay or straight, subject or object, cause or effect. Okay? They say, this way of thinking is too fixed, too universal, in the end everything is being reduced to the either-or. But is the world really built on an either-or principle? If it was built on an either-or, then you would be able to say exactly where, for instance, the world ends. Our world, our world. Where is the end? Where is the limit? You could say, end, nowhere. But there is no limit. The limit is kind of anywhere you like. Do you understand why? Have you noticed how a couple of years ago, and I think I already spoke to you about it, someone jumped from a satellite onto Earth with a parachute from the stratosphere. From the stratosphere with a parachute and landed on his feet. Yeah? So where the end, where is the end of this Earth? There is no line, there is no either-or. So this either-or thing, which is so deeply ingrained in the way we make politics, in the way we make relationships, in the way we think of our own identity, is artificial, limiting, it's restricting. Everything in the end is derived from this opposition. Because you can be either or. Yeah? No in between. No third sex. No, can I be a man on Monday and a woman on Tuesday and something else on Thursday? Why not? Why not? It would be more fun, even though you might need a more extensive wardrobe. But that would be fun. But no, you cannot. Why? Because you can be one or the other. Yeah. So they say you have to take issue with this way of thinking. You need to somehow find a way to free yourself, because think how it translates politically. You either a European or you are a migrant. Yeah? You either with us or you are against us. You are either one of us or you are a foreigner or the other. Yeah? So that really you can see the sharp edge of the binary way of thinking operating in today's debate in the parliament. They're going to debate for 10 hours whether to bomb Syria. Yeah? There is this wedge is driven very, very sharply, and it's all this either or. And you can see how the approach that says, so you can see how there is a kind of possibility of thinking in terms of connections, in terms of saying, well, some people call it unintended consequences. But they're unintended by who? They're not really unintended consequences, they're just the consequences. The consequences are impossible to calculate or predict because it's all interconnected. Yeah? You cannot just go and selectively bomb something and achieve a certain result, because there are processes, there are connections. Yeah? So this is a very kind of simplistic and immediate level, but so I just wanted to really start to get it straight. I really want to start to get I really need to go try to answer that. It's their status. This is just wait through this for another half an hour. it really helps. But so I want to start to get a sense how the binary way of thinking is also a particular kind of politics. Yeah? And this kind of politics can very easily become reactionary because it operates on this idea of the other who is not me. The other who is not me. Yeah? That can mean that you are not me, therefore I don't have any responsibility for you. That also means that a person of a different skin color, of a different sexual orientation or religion or whatever you like can be just labeled as the other, and that anything is permitted. A border is permitted, you know, regulations, you know, restrictions are permitted. So this way of thinking that labels someone as the other is connected to binary, to logical binary thinking, subject, object, cause and effect. And so this has immediate political consequences. Last week we spoke about that Foucault is saying that one of the objectives, the main objective of Deleuze and Guattari, is to help us to trace all the residues of fascism in our own life. Yeah, they say fascism is not over there in the Nazi Germany, in the Italy of Mussolini, or Spain of Franco, or China of Mao, or Russia of Stalin. None of these things. It is in us, they say. That is the really dangerous, explosive message of this book. And when you start thinking about the traces of fascism in us, you come to realize that binary thinking has a lot to do with a particular political program. Are you on board with that? Yeah? Good.
Can you explain what you mean by political? Because for my understanding, it's something to do with government or countries. So because that's how I see.
You say that all governments are like this?
No, I mean, what do you mean by the word politics? Because
Okay.
when I study it, that means like something to do with the government or country. So.
Okay, yeah. There are two approaches to what political means. One is that politics is what governments do, and we, the citizens, we are invited to maybe vote in elections once in 4 years. The rest of the time we are just free to lead our apolitical life. There is another approach that says everything is political. The personal is political. Personal decisions you make in terms of even, you know, what you buy, where you live, whom you are going out with, these are all political decisions. Yeah. So, for instance, not long ago in the United States, if you were a white person and you went out with a black person and you went hand in hand in the street, that was political. Yeah, that could be very dangerous. So when you get chased by gangs because you are walking hand in hand with a person of the wrong color, then this is political.
If we say that binarism should be political, therefore is that I'm not sure if it then can be logical.
Is it logical?
Yeah, I don't think it can be logical for situations.
Why not?
Because it's not based on logic. Because political is based on power or process.
How in the politics, by what mechanism the government convinces us that we should obey the laws they pass? Do we obey the laws because there is a policeman that makes sure that we will obey them? Sometimes. But often we obey because we are convinced that it is logical. We are convinced that it is making sense.
Also, if they
Very often you will hear politicians saying This is just plain common sense.
Yeah, but that in itself is difficult.
I know.
Breaking from the political is convincing people that one thing is more logical over the other. It doesn't mean that I necessarily agree, because also the political process takes away my power as an individual to not agree. So I have to abide by the law whether or not I think it's logical or not.
You have to abide by the law because there is a system of punishment. That's right. But at the same time, we also obey the law because we are convinced that it is making sense. If we didn't think, if we thought that if we thought that we obey the law only because we are forced to obey, if we obey only out of fear of punishment, yeah, that I think would be quite different from the way society really operates. We kind of, you don't know.
It might not be fear of punishment, but it's fear of ostracization, it's fear of difference, it's fear of separation, it's fear of isolation. It's not fear necessarily of punishment of breaking the law and going to go to jail.
So
but culturally, I might not agree with the law, but I have to fit in with the society that has been created.
But culturally, you might not agree with the law, but there will be part of society who will see this law as perfectly logical.
For sure, but what I'm saying is that but then it still can't be binary. If we're going to then fragment binary, binary is just two opposites, and now we've got another group, which is the group that does agree that it's logical, and the group that doesn't agree that it's logical.
Isn't that binary? I'm not completely clear what you are saying, because I think it's a very important point. Let me try to rephrase what you're saying. So it seems to me that you're saying, Ebony, that the binary logic cannot be the basis of politics.
No, I'm saying that if I take that politics is the basis of, if I agree that politics are the basis of the binary system, I don't think that necessarily makes it logical.
No. What makes the binary logical is the binary itself. The binary is a logical expression. We can write it on the, or basically the binary means that A can never be a B.
Yeah, this I agree. But if you make this intrinsic link to politics,
yes,
then for me the logic becomes more questionable.
The argument that Deleuze and Guattari are making is that governments or systems of governance are exploiting, or let's say using, logic as a form of justification or legitimacy. So logic is used to give legitimacy to a political order.
See, I would say politics is used to justify logic.
That's also true. I agree with you. I agree with you, but it works exactly both ways. As they were saying, the production is already consumption. And, you know, you are right. It does work both ways. Logic is not independent from ideology. But ideology also needs logic to appear reasonable. Because if ideology is completely unreasonable, then you will really need a policeman on every street corner to make sure that people will do things. But most of the time we do things because we kind of are convinced that on some level they make sense. Or at least that some people are convinced they make sense. Yeah? Yes?
Because it's like the binary part is a problem in all societies all over.
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
Well, I think it is important that Foucault said at the beginning that this is about Europe. And their analysis is of the Western mindset. Whether all societies are binary, I think really it would be a good question to open up and to say what you think.
Because what I'm thinking is that you have binary as some kind of intrinsic individual
function of
Yeah.
behaviors. Maybe we can live because
Is
we have to
binary-
reduce the world in some way. But
Is
you-
binary genetic?
Yes, but you have a choice to interpret binary. You can either be in a shitty way or you can be in a good way.
Yes.
I think to me the in-between between the binaries is really related to what Boyce says, I think, because he says, don't vote for politics, vote for yourself and vote for arts. And this could be probably the in-between, right?
We need to ask where the binary is coming from. Huh?
Yeah.
Where the binary coming from? What do you think?
From like a hierarchy.
Whose hierarchy?
Like once you're born, you're in it.
Well, as you're born, they said, as you're born, nothing of the sort. You don't even have a sense of self. You just have this, milk suckling pump.
It's just easier for people, I think, to categorize.
That's right.
It's so easy to put it, I don't know, in
The binary, you could say, is connected to the moment when you not you, but let's take the newborn baby. At the early moments of baby's development, this little creature doesn't think of itself as independent, let's say, from the mother. It and the breast and the milk, it's always one thing. At some point, there will be separation. At some point, this creature also has to learn that you just cannot go defecate wherever you like. You need to behave according to socially acceptable norms. So you learn the binary in this way. This is me. This is them. This is I. Yes. Now, it's a good question to ask whether this is the only way to develop. Whether it is possible to develop or to grow up or to live in a non-binary or a less binary society. That's why I think it's a really good question to ask. Are all societies equally based on binary distinctions? Deleuze and Guattari seem to suggest, at least, let's say, that schizophrenia does not operate in binaries. The artist does not operate in binaries. And they have some other examples. The nomad, so the person who is not aligned to a particular government or a system. Yet a nomad who is moving freely, let's say, through the lands, through the fields, through the steppe, as a nomad, as a cattle. What is the name? People who would say follow the cattle, or they say live in movement, on a horseback. For a person like that, the Mongolian tribes, they just used to move without settling down in any particular place. For them, and we will see it in some other places, their way of thinking is much less binary, because there is no notion of order based on this rational equation. It's holistic. Holistic is one way to think about it, but it's not so much holistic. It's more in terms of the immediate present or the becoming nomadic. Holistic, I think, it brings in a slightly different dimension. Nomadic existence is not holistic. It can be very difficult, painful. It can be at odds with, let's say, a state. But it is less subjected to this logic of the binary. Okay, you have a problem with the binary. Let me try to resolve it by saying, let's substitute the binary with representation. Let's say that all these things, like cause and effect, subject and object, are various aspects aspects of representational thinking. And what is representational thinking? It's this idea that here I am, there is the world, and I can know the world by representing it to myself as a picture. Yeah, but this is already, representation is always binary. Do you accept that? Everybody? That representation is binary? The categorization is binary. But okay, so if you accept it, why do you think representation is binary?
Because representation is always from
Yeah, because you have the representer and the represented, the subject and the object. Now, is politics representation? That's right.
So therefore,
And also the binary is given. Yes.
to see the binary as intrinsically political, I think it's also possible.
Okay, maybe the binary is not intrinsically political, but the binary has the potential to be harnessed in politics. Okay, fine. So I think if we, and then I guess the question might be, what could it be possible, for instance, that regimes that are more inclined towards fascism are the ones where the binary notion runs deep? Could there be a connection like this? You know, so for instance, in the Nazi Germany, as we mentioned last week, the binary is very clear cut. You are either Aryan or you are not Aryan. And if you are not, you have to wear your difference. You have to wear your binary difference on your sleeve or on your lapel. Yeah. So it seems like that could be. But okay, I think if we accept that the binary itself is not. But however, I think later on we might be able to revisit this question, and perhaps it would be possible to ask again where the notion of logic is coming from. Is logic can entirely separate the notion of logic from the notion of politics? Can we claim some kind of immaculate conception of logic that is totally apolitical?
It's driven by the same and it is about whether you are object is subject or situation. So for me, if I look at one group, they are related, but for those people, when they look at themselves, they're not related. So even if it's not as logic, it's still objective.
Okay. Okay.
I think when we are talking about binary, usually there's this kind of notion there are two equal sides, and that's I think what kind of confuses or makes you in a way refuse the binary as this intrinsic political. But political always defines itself in a way as us and them. That's why there is, so the binary would not be like there are two possibilities, but there's this inclusion of how do I identify with what kind of politics and then exclude the others. This is how the politics work. That's why this binary, it doesn't have to be the opposite in the sense of, okay, this is left and right, but it can be, it is enough to say you are other than me to create this binary relationship.
Binary as to have no problem with the binary. It doesn't have to be equal. This is not my question. But sorry, repeat what you just said before. You were saying about if we go later.
Let's move on. Because we only have 10 minutes. I don't want to. It's not because I don't want to deal with with a question. I think it is absolutely
I don't
crucial.
even know my questions.
I think, well, I think you raised a really important question about the connection between logic and ideology, logic and politics. It's a crucial question, and we will need to come back to that. So we're not completely not parking this issue. We will revisit it. You might want to have a look at, do you know Louise Althusser? You probably came across, yeah? He has a book, a little book that's called On Ideology, I think. I'm only saying it because it seems to me that you might find it interesting. I'm not necessarily putting it on all of your reading list, unless ideology is of a specific interest. Let's have a look at, this is the second meaning of the process as we use the term. Man and nature are not like two opposite terms confronting each other, not even in the sense of bipolar opposites. Rather, they are one and the same essential reality, the producer-product. So, man and nature are one and the same essential reality. How that translates to talking about an art object? You might say, for instance, that an artist's statement and the art object are not two separate entities, but are one. So your artist's statement is not the explanation of the art, but it is the art. They are together. So maybe the artwork is not what you put on the wall, but it's also not what you put on a sheet of paper, but what is emerging between them. Does it make sense? Then you also might say that the artwork is neither in the canvas or the sculpture, nor is it you, but again, the process of the negotiation, of the process of the flows of energies between you and this clay you are forming, or this rubbish you are working with, or whatever. Yeah, that's how you can start thinking about this notion that whenever you find yourself falling into this, what they call the bipolar opposites, as the black or the white, the male or the female, that's where they say alarm bells should be ringing, because you already subscribe to an ideological position, to a position that accepts power, to a position that accepts authority. Does it make sense? Okay. So, and could someone read to us this thing is really interesting. The next section. Timo, you have
from production to
Please,
process. Production as a process overtakes all idealistic categories and constitutes a cycle whose relationship to desire is that of an immanent principle. That is why desiring production is the principal concern of materialist psychiatry, which conceives of and deals with the schizo as homo natura.
Okay, that's a little bit complicated, but I just wanted you to get the sense of desiring production. What is desiring production? Isn't that somehow connects to the way you make your art? Given that you probably do make your art, why do you make art? Do you not make art because you arrive at the logical conclusion that this is the most rational way to live your life? And if you do something seriously wrong with your logic, you do it because you desire it. The consequences might be painful. You still have the desire. It's kind of, it's non-negotiable. Yes, it's a desire. If you desire someone, another human being, it would be very hard to somehow switch this desire off by saying, you know, but really, he's very bad for you. You know, well, cigarettes are bad, but it's also addictive. You know, and desire can be like that. So But at the same time, Deleuze and Guattari say, realize that desire is always production. Production, when you, let's say, if you put a shelf on the wall in your house in the weekend, why do you do that? Is it because there is nothing on the telly? Well, let's say no, on some level, there is a desire. Maybe the desire is just to have a bookshelf. Maybe you desire to have a slightly more upmarket house. Maybe the desire is to cover some ugly stain on the wall. But there is a desire. It's the desire that drives you to put a shelf. Do you understand? Why is it important? Because they say, if you want to understand labor, work, and the politics of labor, you need to understand how desire operates. Why are you here? Why you are here today? Partly because, okay, you have to. Some of you don't, which is amazing. But partly because you have to. Okay. Partly also is because you wanted to be. Yeah? Because I think if you didn't want, it would be very hard to get to the other. But this is the interesting thing. They say, Deleuze and Guattari, always try to find the desire that drives forward production, but also realize that production is always, that's the trace desire leaves. When you desire something or anything, that will always involve a process of making. Sexual desire might produce a child. Okay, we get that. But desire of any kind is productive. You produce an output. The production is the outcome of desire. The production itself is a process of desire. That suggests also that you don't start from an idea in making your art. You don't start from a concept, and you don't start from a solution to a problem. You start from the design. So if you can find out a little bit more about the desire that drives you, compels you, seduces you, you get a bit more insight into your own process. It's a very, you know how often not in central markets, but in other institutions, sometimes when people come to talk about your work, they start from asking, so what was the idea here? Yeah. Well, now you know the answer. And what is the answer? And that's okay. It's okay to say, I done it because I wanted to do it. I done it because I was curious about what will come out. You don't need to start from an idea. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm saying you don't have to. You can start simply because you are curious. I think traditionally, romantically, that was also the justification for the scientific experiment. You experimented with nature because you were curious to find out how it works. I think that these days science is too institutionalized to really say, you know what, I'm just kind of doing it out of curiosity. But as an artist, this is your obligation. This is your absolutely rigorously scientific process to start from design. Another way of coming at the same point is, and I think it comes out in tutorials when we talk about your work. Let's say you make a work. Let's say you paint a landscape. Paint a landscape or photograph landscape. How do you know which spot you're going to paint a photograph, or what part of the landscape you're going to focus on? Now, is there a logical procedure that says, okay, well here the balance between the rocks and the sky, kind of, I can see the thirds here, you know, the soft and the... No, you start from something you have emotional connection with. only if you start with something you have an emotional connection with, you might make a good piece. If you don't have an emotional connection, you might produce an illustration, but it will be kind of dead. It will be sort of like a cast. Yeah? Because it will not be your own. And what does it mean to make something your own? Well, it is starting from desire as the driving force of the process, which is not to say that it's all about, kind of fun and games. Because, for instance, some of you made works that were quite painful, quite difficult. But there was, for instance, you remember the earthquake piece? You called it 23 seconds, yeah? Was it? Yeah. That was a painful thing to do, wasn't it? But there was a kind of emotional connection. I mean, you spoke about it, that's why it's kind of easy to use it as an example. And it's the emotional connection that is the starting point, So if someone asks, why did you do that? Then I guess you will not say because something important happened and I had to tell the world. Maybe that also comes into it. Maybe you had to make a record. Maybe you had to explain something. But there was also a drive that is not logical, is not in terms of cause and effect. It is in terms of your own desire, your own emotional connection. Yeah? So, as artists, you may not somehow disregard that and build on top of it some kind of logical explanation. It would be a false move. That's what Deleuze and Guattari are saying. The proper strategy would be to realize that your production is always a process of, as they say, it is the principle of your art production is desired. But I guess, if the newly born infant did not desire the milk, it would be very difficult to keep them alive. Yeah? There has to be a desire. Now yes, there is hunger. But there is also the desire for the pleasure of the warm milk and the soft breast. Yeah? So there is a pleasure there. So why the baby suckles milk? Is it to satisfy, is it to produce the milk and satiate hunger? Or is it because there is a pleasure in being held in the warmth of the body, in the warmth of the milk? Well, what Deleuze and Guattari say, it's both. You need to desire to produce. The production is the production of desire. And here I think we can stop. But just before you get up, do you have one more session next week? Yes? And that's it, yeah? Do you want to continue with Anti-Oedipus?
Yeah.
I think we need to continue. Great, so next week, Anti-Oedipus again. Shall we read Materialist Psychiatry? Read The Body Without Organs. The Body Without Organs. Sorry? No, it's a short section. And A Materialist Psychiatry.